Every pharaoh had enemies. That's not a secret. It's carved on every temple wall in Egypt. The king grips a row of prisoners by the hair, raises his arm, and strikes. You've seen the image 1,000 times, but that image is theater. It's a pose, a symbol repeated so often it stopped meaning anything specific. The real work happened somewhere quieter, a small room, a scribe with a clay figurine and a reed brush, and a list, names, titles, places, written in neat, careful script across the surface of the clay. Then the figurine was smashed, the pieces were buried, and the people whose names were on it were, as far as the Egyptian state was concerned, already gone. Not every pharaoh kept a list like that. One did it with a precision that still unsettles the scholars who study him, and the list survived. This channel is for people who are done with surface-level history. If that's you, subscribe. In 1963, a French archaeological team working at Mirgissa, a ruined Egyptian fortress complex near the second cataract of the Nile, in what is now northern Sudan, uncovered something they were not expecting. They had come for the fortress, the walls, the granaries, the garrison quarters, standard military architecture from the Middle Kingdom, roughly 4,000 years old, built to control traffic along the most strategically important waterway in the ancient world. What they found instead was a pit, not large, not deep, easy to miss, frankly, in a landscape that already looked like rubble. Inside, fragments, hundreds of them, broken pottery, smashed figurines, small, crudely shaped, vaguely human. Red ceramic vessels, deliberately shattered, traces of ash and charred material. And beneath everything, positioned with obvious care before the breaking began, a bound figure, a clay form with its arms tied behind its back using actual cord. Real cord. Preserved by the desert for nearly 38 centuries, which is the kind of detail that stops you mid-excavation and reminds you that the distance between now and then is thinner than it should be. The team collected the fragments, catalogued them, transported them for study. And when the inscriptions were finally pieced together and read in hieratic script, Egypt's administrative shorthand, what emerged was not a prayer, not a dedication, not any of the devotional or funerary texts that Egyptian sites typically yield. It was a list of names, names of rulers, specific rulers of specific places. The chief of a Nubian territory south of the cataract, identified by name and by his mother's name. The ruler of a Libyan group to the west, similarly identified. Rulers of city-states in the Levant, Byblos, Ashkelon, and a place called Isha Mumu that scholars have identified, with varying degrees of confidence, as one of the earliest known written references to Jerusalem. Each name followed by a formula. And the formula was not a greeting. It was a comprehensive, systematic invocation of destruction, directed at the named individual, their family, their allies, their plans, their words, their actions, their thoughts, and their potential. Their potential. The phrasing, reconstructed from these and related collections, runs something like, the ruler of place, named name, born of mother's name, and all the retainers who are with him. Who may rebel, who may plot, who may fight, who may think of fighting, who may think of rebelling in this entire land. Read that sequence again. It starts with action, rebellion, conspiracy, combat. Then it moves inward, through intention, through consideration, all the way down to the private, unspoken possibility of resistance forming somewhere inside a person's mind. The state claimed jurisdiction over that too. And then the figurine carrying those names was smashed, ground into the sand, buried in a pit at the edge of Egyptian-controlled territory, in a fortress built to watch the border, surrounded by the remains of other smashed things, red vessels, ash, bound figures. The whole assemblage placed there not by soldiers in a hurry, but by priests following a protocol. Carefully, ritually, on schedule. The Mirgissa deposits were not unique. That is what makes them significant. By the time these figurines were studied, scholars already knew about two other major collections of identical material: the so-called Berlin execration texts and the Brussels figurines, both acquired by European museums in the late 19th and early 20th centuries under circumstances that were, to put it generously, not well documented. The Berlin group dates to roughly 1900 BCE, slightly earlier than Mirgissa. The Brussels group overlaps with Mirgissa in date and is strikingly similar in content. Together, these three collections, and scattered fragments from other sites, reveal something that a single find might not. This was not an isolated act, not a single pharaoh's personal rage committed to clay. This was a practice, a state-organized, bureaucratically maintained, regularly updated practice with standardized language, consistent formatting, and a scope that expanded over time. The Berlin texts, the earlier set, tend to name enemies in collective terms. Groups, not individuals. The rulers of Nubia, broadly. The people of Libya as a mass. But the later texts, Brussels, Mirgissa, are different. They are granular. Specific names, specific mothers' names, specific titles, specific places, often small places, places that suggest detailed intelligence about the political landscape far beyond Egypt's borders. Between the two sets, separated by perhaps 50 to 75 years, something changed. The state's knowledge of its enemies became sharper, more precise. The apparatus grew. And here is where the debate begins, a debate that has occupied Egyptologists for decades, and that, I should be honest, I have gone back and forth on myself more times than I'd like to admit. The question is straightforward. What were these texts for? Were they purely ritual, a symbolic act performed by priests to maintain cosmic order with no direct connection to military or political action? Were they operational, a reflection of actual intelligence, a catalogue of real targets marked for real elimination? Or were they something in between? Something that the Egyptian administrative mind would not have distinguished, because in their framework, ritual action and political action were not separate categories? I've spent years with this material. I've read the scholarly arguments on every side, and I think, though I hold this as interpretation, not fact, that the answer is all three, simultaneously without contradiction. The Egyptian state did not separate the act of writing an enemy's name on a figurine and smashing it from the act of sending an army to that enemy's territory. Both were real, both were effective, both were line items in the same administrative budget. To ask which one really mattered is to impose a division that the people who made these objects would not have recognized. But what I keep coming back to, what I cannot quite resolve even after all this time, is the gap between the lists and the aftermath. We have the names, we have the ritual, we have the smashed fragments and the buried pits and the bound figures and the ash. What we do not have, not once, in any surviving document, is a record of what happened next. Did armies march against the people named on those figurines? Were assassins dispatched? Were diplomatic threats issued? Were the named rulers even aware that somewhere in an Egyptian fortress a scribe had written their name on a piece of clay and a priest had smashed it into the sand? The archive says nothing, which is itself a kind of answer. Because the silence is selective, Egypt kept extraordinary records: grain inventories, labor rosters, judicial proceedings, diplomatic correspondence, tax assessments, medical prescriptions. The bureaucracy was immense and, by ancient standards, compulsive in its documentation. If the execration ritual was connected to specific military or political follow-up, the administrative trail should exist somewhere. It doesn't. Either those records were kept separately and lost, possible, always possible, or the ritual was understood as complete in itself. The smashing was the action, the burial was the result, and the named enemies were, in the logic of the system, already dealt with. What the Mirgissa excavation gave us then is not a weapon, not a battle plan, not a list of the dead. It is something harder to categorize and, in some ways, harder to sit with. A window into a state that believed it could destroy its enemies by writing their names in careful script on small clay figures and breaking them in the dark at the edge of the known world in a pit that no one was ever meant to open. And someone, a specific person sitting in a specific room, trained in a specific tradition, wrote those names. Neatly, legibly, in professional hieratic, then handed the figurine to a priest who carried it to the pit and smashed it. And both of them went home that evening believing they had done something real. The name of the pharaoh whose administration produced the most systematic, most extensive, and most geographically ambitious set of these execration texts is Senusret III. And his story, the story of the man behind the lists, begins not at a fortress but at a face. His face is wrong. That is the first thing anyone notices when they encounter a statue of Senusret III, and it is the thing that has kept scholars arguing for over a century. Egyptian royal portraiture follows rules, rigid, deeply conservative rules that persisted for millennia. The pharaoh is shown young, strong, idealized, smooth-skinned, heavy-lidded, serene. A face beyond time, beyond aging, beyond the ordinary decay that afflicts everyone who is not a living god. That is the template. Every dynasty followed it. Every royal sculptor understood that the face of the king was not a portrait. It was a theological statement. Senusret III broke the template. His statues, and there are many found at sites across Egypt and Nubia, show a face carved with deep furrows running from nose to mouth, heavy, downturned lips, eyes that are not serene but hooded, strained, almost bruised with fatigue. The brow is creased, the jaw is set. The overall impression is not of divinity but of endurance, a man carrying something he cannot put down, and the weight of it has settled permanently into the architecture of his face. This was not an accident of one sculptor's hand. The same features appear consistently across multiple statues from different sites, carved by different workshops over the course of a reign that lasted roughly 39 years, from around 1878 to 1839 BCE. The consistency means one thing: these features were prescribed. Someone, Senusret himself, his court, his image makers, decided that the king of Egypt should look exhausted, should look burdened, should look for the first time in Egyptian royal art like a man who was paying a visible price for what he carried. I've stood in front of these statues in 3 different museums, and every time the same thought arrives. Not an academic thought, just a gut reaction. This man is not performing strength, he is performing cost. He wants you to see what ruling has done to him because the damage is the proof. The question is, proof of what? And for whom? To answer that, you have to understand what Senusret III inherited. Not just a throne. Every pharaoh inherited a throne. He inherited a political problem that had been building for 200 years, and it had nothing to do with Nubians or Libyans or anyone whose name might end up on a clay figurine. The problem was inside the house. Egypt's Middle Kingdom, the era scholars sometimes call the classical age of Egyptian civilization, running roughly from 2055 to 1650 BCE, was founded on a compromise. The preceding period, known as the First Intermediate Period, had been an era of fragmentation. Central authority collapsed. Regional governors, the nomarchs, filled the vacuum. They raised their own troops, collected their own taxes, administered their own justice, and built their own tombs. Tombs that in some cases rivaled the kings in ambition, if not in scale. Egypt did not cease to exist during this period, but it ceased to be one thing. It became a patchwork of local powers held loosely together by the memory of unity and not much else. When the Middle Kingdom pharaohs reunified the country, beginning with Mentuhotep II around 2055 BCE and consolidated by the 12th dynasty founders Amenemhat I and Senusret I, they did so by negotiating with these regional powers, not by destroying them. The nomarchs kept their territories, kept their titles, kept their local courts, their land holdings, their administrative autonomy. In exchange, they acknowledged the pharaoh's supremacy, contributed to royal building projects, and supplied troops when called upon. It was a practical arrangement. It worked, and it meant that for the first century and a half of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt was governed not by a single absolute authority, but by an uneasy alliance between the crown and a network of powerful provincial families who had very long memories and very deep roots. The tombs tell you everything you need to know. At Beni Hassan in Middle Egypt, a cliff face holds a row of rock-cut tombs belonging to the nomarchs of the Oryx Nome, a single provincial district. These tombs are enormous. Their painted walls depict the governors receiving tribute, overseeing harvests, commanding wrestlers and soldiers, presiding over feasts. The autobiographical inscriptions inside them are blunt about the source of their power. One governor boasts of his irrigation works. Another describes commanding local troops in a military campaign. A third records his role in adjudicating a border dispute between nomes, a function that, in a fully centralized state, would belong to the crown. These are not the tombs of subordinates. These are the tombs of men who understood themselves as rulers. Lesser rulers, perhaps. Rulers who deferred to the pharaoh in matters of national scope. But rulers nonetheless, with hereditary authority, independent resources, and the confidence to carve their achievements into cliff faces that would last forever. By the time Senusret III came to power, this system had been in place for nearly 2 centuries, and whatever the official relationship between crown and nomarchs, the structural tension was obvious. Every powerful nomarch was a potential rival. Every provincial army was a force the king did not fully control. Every grand tomb at Beni Hassan or Mer or Deir el-Basha was a statement, carved in stone, painted in bright pigment, visible for miles. That power in Egypt was distributed, not absolute. Senusret III ended this, not through war, not through purges, at least none that the record preserves, not through any single dramatic confrontation that a documentary could stage with torchlight and tense music. He ended it through administration, through reorganization, through the quiet, methodical restructuring of how Egypt was governed, which does not sound dramatic until you understand what it meant for the people it erased. He divided Egypt into 3 administrative departments, roughly corresponding to Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, and the southern frontier zone. Each department was overseen by a council reporting to a vizier who reported to the king. Provincial governance was absorbed into this new structure. The nomarch's traditional functions, tax collection, judicial authority, military command, labor organization, were transferred to crown-appointed officials operating within the new departmental system. And the nomarchs vanished. Not physically, no mass graves, no trial records, no exile decrees. They vanished administratively. The grand tombs stopped being built. The autobiographical inscriptions that had proclaimed regional authority for generations, they ceased. The hereditary titles that had passed from father to son for 200 years either disappeared entirely or became ceremonial honors awarded by the court, detached from any territorial function. An entire class of people, Egypt's provincial ruling elite, families who had governed regions since before the Middle Kingdom existed, was absorbed into a centralized bureaucracy and, in political terms, dissolved. The Lahun papyri help fill in the picture from the other side. Lahun, also called Kahun, was a planned town built near the pyramid of Senusret II, Senusret III's father, and it continued to function well into Senusret III's reign and beyond. The administrative documents found there reveal a state apparatus of startling precision, labor rosters, tracking individual workers by name, task, and daily output, supply inventories listing grain, bread, beer, and linen allocations down to fractional units, correspondence between officials following strict chains of command that run upward, always upward, toward the capital. This is not the paperwork of a kingdom that shares power. This is the paperwork of a kingdom that has gathered every thread into a single hand and is keeping count. The conventional framing, the one you'll find in most survey textbooks, calls Senusret III a great centralizer, a strong king who consolidated royal power and created a more efficient state. And that's true, as far as it goes. But it doesn't go far enough, because centralization is an abstract word, and what it describes is not abstract at all. It describes specific families waking up one morning to discover that the authority their grandfathers exercised, the titles their fathers held, the future their sons expected, all of it had been reorganized out of existence, not taken by force, not challenged in battle, just reclassified. Call it reform. No, that word is too clean. It implies improvement without cost. Call it restructuring, which at least carries the faint scent of something institutional and cold, because that is closer to what it was. And here is the connection that most accounts of Senusret III's reign fail to draw clearly enough. The execration texts, the figurines, the lists, the ritual smashing. were products of this same administration. The same mind that reorganized Egypt's provinces into 3 crown-controlled departments also maintained a ritual apparatus for identifying, naming, and symbolically destroying threats, foreign and domestic, with bureaucratic regularity. The same state that dissolved the nomarchs through administrative absorption also kept a regularly updated catalogue of enemies whose names were inscribed on clay, cursed by formula, and shattered into pits at the edge of the world. These were not separate programs, they were expressions of the same governing logic, the identification and neutralization of anything that existed outside the pharaoh's direct control. Whether the instrument was a new departmental chart or a smashed figurine, the purpose was identical. Eliminate independent power, close every gap, leave nothing ungoverned, unnamed, unaccounted for. I keep thinking about the statues, the exhausted face, the furrows and the heavy lids and the set jaw. If the face was propaganda, and it was, all royal portraiture was propaganda, then what was it advertising? Not youth, not divine perfection, not the effortless superiority that every other pharaoh's image projected. It was advertising the weight, the burden of total vigilance, the cost of being the kind of ruler who could not afford a single uncontrolled variable, not a nomarch with independent troops, not a Nubian chief beyond the frontier, not even an unnamed possibility of rebellion forming in someone's mind. The face said, "Look what this requires. Look what I endure for you." The lines on the stone were the price of the lists in the sand, or at least that's what the face wanted you to believe. Whether Senusret III actually felt that burden, or whether the exhaustion was as calculated as the administrative restructuring, as precise, as deliberate, as strategically deployed, is a question the statues will never answer. Stone holds its expression. It does not explain it. What I can tell you is what the nomarchs might have felt. The last generation, the ones who watched it happen. To have grown up inside a family that governed a region, that built tombs in cliff faces, commanded local troops, judged local disputes, managed the irrigation that kept people alive, and then to see all of that quietly absorbed into a new organizational structure emanating from the capital. No enemy to confront, no battle to fight, no injustice to protest because the restructuring was legal, orderly, and wrapped in the language of royal authority that everyone, including the nomarchs themselves, had spent generations agreeing to respect. Just a letter, perhaps, or a visit from a newly appointed departmental official. A polite explanation that the old title would be honored, of course at court, a ceremonial position, a seat at festivals, but that the actual administration of the region would now be handled differently, more efficiently, more directly. And the tomb in the cliff face that your father started, the one where the painters were halfway through the wrestling scene, well, there would be no need to finish it now. I want to stay with the words for a moment. Not the statues, not the fortresses, not the geopolitics, the words themselves, the ones written on the figurines before they were smashed. Because the language of the execration texts is where the system reveals itself most completely, and it is the part that, after all my years with this material, I find the hardest to shake. The standard formula, reconstructed from the Berlin, Brussels, and Mirgissa collections, and cross-referenced by multiple scholars working independently, follows a pattern so consistent that it was clearly prescribed. This was not improvised speech. It was a template, a bureaucratic form filled in with specific names the way a modern government might fill in a warrant. The structure runs roughly like this: the ruler of a named place, his personal name, his mother's name, and then all the retainers who are with him, all the people of his territory who are with him, who may rebel, who may plot, who may fight, who may think of fighting, who may think of rebelling in this entire land. That cascade, from action to intention to thought, is not accidental. Egyptian administrative language was precise. These were not scribes throwing words at clay in a frenzy. They were trained professionals working from a formula that had been refined, tested, and handed down, and every element in it carried specific weight. The progression from who may rebel down to who may think of rebelling was deliberate. It was designed to close every gap, to leave no category of threat unnamed, to reach past behavior, past planning, past even the formation of intent, all the way down to the raw cognitive possibility that somewhere inside a person the state had identified, the seed of resistance might one day germinate. The state claimed jurisdiction over seeds, and the scope didn't end with the named individual. All the retainers who are with him extended the curse outward to advisors, guards, servants, family members, anyone in the orbit of the named enemy. All the people of his territory went further still, encompassing entire populations. The figurine carrying the name of a single Nubian chief might, by the logic of its own inscription, be targeting thousands of people. The named individual was the center, but the radius of destruction was, by design, total. Now, here is where I need to be careful, because what I'm about to describe is not something I can verify with the certainty I'd prefer. The ritual context of the smashing, how it was performed, by whom, in what sequence, is reconstructed from archaeological evidence, not from a surviving instruction manual. No text has been found that says, Step 1, inscribe the figurine. Step 2, recite the formula. Step 3, smash. What we have instead is the physical residue of the ritual and the informed interpretation of scholars who have spent careers piecing together the fragments. So what follows is reconstruction. Credible reconstruction, grounded in material evidence, but reconstruction nonetheless. At Mirgissa, the deposits were not simply thrown into a pit, they were layered. The bound figurine, the one with real cord binding its arms, was placed first, or at least positioned with clear intentionality at the base of the deposit. The inscribed figurines and pottery were smashed on top of or around it. Red vessels were included, red being a color associated in Egyptian symbolic practice with the desert, with chaos, with the god Seth, and with everything that threatened the ordered world the state was built to maintain. There is evidence of burning. Some fragments show heat damage, whether the entire deposit was set alight or whether specific elements were burned before burial. The archaeology doesn't resolve cleanly, but the overall picture is coherent. This was choreographed destruction. Layered, sequenced, performed in a specific location, at the fortress, at the border, at the boundary between Egypt's controlled world and the uncontrolled world beyond. The placement was not random, the boundary was the point. The ritual was performed at the edge because the edge was where the threat lived, and the destruction was meant to radiate outward into the territory of the people whose names had been written and broken, and the writing itself. This is the detail I keep returning to, the one that sits in my mind like a stone I can't quite swallow. The script on the figurines is neat, professional, unhurried. These were not scratched in panic by a frightened priest during a crisis. They were written in standard hieratic by a trained scribe, probably sitting in a room with good light, working from a list, an administrative list compiled from intelligence reports, diplomatic correspondence, frontier dispatches, whatever sources the state had assembled about the current configuration of its enemies. The scribe wrote the names the way a clerk files paperwork, carefully, legibly, completely. Then he handed the figurine to someone else, and it was carried to the pit and destroyed. I think about that scribe sometimes, not because he's historically significant. He isn't, we'll never know his name, but because he makes the system real in a way the pharaoh's statues don't. Senusret III is a face on stone, an idea, a policy. The scribe is a person with a reed brush, sitting in a room that smelled like ink, writing the name of a Nubian chief he had never met onto a clay figure he knew would be shattered before nightfall, and then doing it again, the next name and the next. However many names the current list required, and then going home, to dinner, to family, to whatever private life a scribe in a Middle Kingdom fortress maintained, carrying the knowledge that he had by the logic of everything he'd been taught, participated in the destruction of real human beings in a way his civilization considered as concrete as a spear through the chest. To understand why the Egyptians considered this concrete, and they did, this was not metaphor to them, you have to understand something about how they related to written language. And I want to be precise here, because this is a point that documentaries routinely bungle by making it sound mystical when it was, within its own framework, entirely rational. In the Egyptian understanding of the world, as their priests and scholars articulated it across thousands of texts, a person's name was not a label. It was a component of their being. They recognized multiple elements that constituted a complete person: the physical body, the Kai, a kind of vital force or double, the Ba, something closer to personality or individual essence, the shadow, and the name. Each was necessary. Destroy any one of them and the person was diminished. Destroy the name, truly destroy it, not just forget it, but annihilate every written instance of it, and you attacked the foundation of the person's existence in both this world and whatever came after. This belief was not casual, it was structural. It underwrote the entire Egyptian funerary system, the reason tombs bore names, the reason statues were inscribed, the reason the worst punishment the state could inflict was the erasure of a person's name from every monument and record. Damnatio memoriae, the Romans would later call it. The Egyptians practiced it first, and they practiced it not as a political gesture, but as, in their understanding, an ontological assault. The execration texts weaponized this belief. To write a name on a figurine was to give it material reality, to anchor the person's existence in a physical object. To smash that object was to destroy the anchor. The ritual did not merely wish harm on the enemy. By the logic of the system, it enacted harm. The scribe who wrote the name created the target. The priest who smashed the figurine destroyed it. And the state that organized the whole process understood itself to be conducting a military operation as real as any campaign in Nubia, which means the lists were not symbolic kill lists. They were, by the only definition the people who made them would have accepted, actual kill lists, carried out in a medium that their civilization considered as lethal as bronze. I realize how that sounds, and I want to be clear. I am not asking you to believe in the efficacy of the ritual. I am asking you to understand that the people who performed it believed in its efficacy completely, institutionally, with the full weight of the state behind that belief. The budget was real. The scribes were real. The intelligence gathering that fed the lists was real. The administrative infrastructure that maintained the practice across decades, updating names, adding new enemies, refining the formula, was real. The only thing we might question is whether the destruction worked. And the Egyptians would not have understood the question. But there is a further dimension to this, one that the ritual evidence at Mirgissa hints at but doesn't fully explain. The execration texts were not only aimed at foreign enemies. Some of the names, particularly in the later collections, are Egyptian, not many. And they are harder to identify because the titles and place names don't always match cleanly with what we know from other sources. But they are there. Egyptians named in the same formula, subjected to the same ritual, smashed into the same pits alongside Nubian chiefs and Levantine rulers. Who were they? Scholars have proposed several possibilities: disloyal officials, provincial figures who resisted centralization, nomarchs perhaps, or their allies, members of rival court factions, people whose loyalty was doubted, even if no overt act of rebellion had occurred. Remember the formula: who may think of rebelling? The threshold for inclusion on these lists was not action, it was possibility. And in a political environment where the pharaoh was systematically dismantling an entire class of regional power holders, the number of people who might think of rebelling was, by definition, large. This is where the execration texts and Senusret III's domestic reforms converge into a single picture. And it is not a comfortable one. A ruler who eliminated provincial autonomy through administrative restructuring. A ritual system that identified and symbolically destroyed anyone who might resist, including, potentially, the very people being restructured out of power. A bureaucracy that maintained both programs simultaneously with the same precision, the same record-keeping, the same institutional seriousness. The figurines at Mirgissa were found inside the fortress, not outside it, not in a separate ritual space removed from the military installation. Inside the walls, in the same compound where soldiers watched the border and scribes recorded the daily movements of Nubian travelers. The surveillance and the ritual occupied the same ground, served the same administration, and, in the Egyptian understanding, performed the same function. One watched, the other destroyed, and the lists fed both. The Nile does not look the same everywhere. In the delta, it spreads, lazy, braided, heavy with silt, surrounded by green so flat and dense it could be a painting of itself. But south of Aswan, the river changes character. The valley narrows, the sandstone cliffs press closer. The cataracts, those stretches where the bedrock rises and the water churns over granite, turn the Nile from a highway into an obstacle course, and the landscape around them is brutal. Rock, sand. Heat that, even in early morning, carries a physical weight against the skin that you do not forget once you have felt it. This is where Senusret III built his war. Not a single battle, not one campaign that could be dated and filed and closed. a permanent military infrastructure, a chain of fortresses strung along the most inhospitable stretch of the river, from the first cataract down to the second, in territory that was not quite Egyptian and not quite anything else. Buan, Mirgissa, Semna, Kuma, Uronarti, Askut, Shalfak, and others, smaller installations, watchtowers, signal stations, filling the gaps between the major compounds. The whole system covered roughly 400 kilometers of frontier zone, and it was built with a thoroughness that, even by Egyptian standards, borders on obsessive. Buhan alone tells you what kind of project this was. The fortress, excavated extensively before it was submerged by the waters of Lake Nasser, following the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s, was massive. Outer walls, inner walls, a dry moat cut into the bedrock, bastions at regular intervals, a garrison that could house hundreds of soldiers, granaries large enough to sustain a prolonged siege, and administrative quarters where the daily business of watching the border was conducted in writing. This was not a frontier camp thrown up by a nervous general. This was institutional architecture, planned at the capital, budgeted at the national level, and designed to last, not for years, but for centuries. And the fortresses were not primarily defensive. That is the part that most treatments of Senusret's Nubian policy understate or miss entirely. Yes, they defended a border, but their deeper function was control. Specifically, the control of movement, the monitoring of who traveled along the Nile, in what direction, in what numbers, for what purpose. The fortresses were, in modern terms, a surveillance system built in mud brick and stone. We know this because the surveillance reports survived. The Semna dispatches, a collection of administrative documents found not at Semna itself, but at Thebes, where they had been archived by the central government, record the daily observations of Egyptian officers stationed at the frontier. And the level of detail in these reports is, frankly, startling. They do not describe armies, they do not record major incursions or dramatic border crossings. They record small groups, individuals. 2 men and 3 women with their children seen traveling north along the east bank. Their likely point of origin, their probable destination, the time of the sighting, whether they were carrying goods, whether they made contact with anyone at the fortress, whether they continued past or stopped. This is not military intelligence in any conventional sense. This is population monitoring. The state, Senusret's state, the same administration that produced the execration figurines and dissolved the nomarchs, wanted to know about every person who moved through its frontier zone down to the individual. Not because each individual was a threat, but because the system did not distinguish between a threat and an uncontrolled variable. Both required identification. Both required documentation. Both required, in the administration's understanding, management. And the reports went to Thebes. That detail matters. These were not local records kept by garrison commanders for their own operational use. They were copied, compiled, and transmitted upriver to the capital, where they entered the central archive. The same archive that fed the intelligence apparatus. The same apparatus that, among other functions, maintained the lists of enemies whose names would be written on clay and shattered in ritual. The watchtower and the pit were nodes in the same network. I should say clearly, I do not have evidence, no one does, that specific individuals recorded in the Semna dispatches ended up on execration lists. The documents don't connect that explicitly, but the institutional logic connects them implicitly. And after years inside this material, I find implicit connections inside a unified administration more telling than explicit ones inside a fragmented record. The absence of a document linking surveillance to ritual is not, to my mind, proof of separation. It is proof that we are missing a layer of the archive, the layer where the decisions were made. But the fortresses were not only about watching. Senusret III conducted at least 4 major military campaigns in Nubia, recorded in royal inscriptions, commemorative stelae, and the physical evidence of destruction at Nubian settlement sites along the river. These were not defensive operations. They were campaigns of territorial consolidation and, in at least some instances, punitive raids designed to break Nubian resistance permanently. The boundary stela at Semna, Senusret's own text, carved in his own voice, erected at the point he defined as the southern limit of Egyptian territory, is one of the most aggressive royal inscriptions in all of Egyptian history. And I want to stay with its tone, because the tone is where the inscription betrays something the words alone do not intend. Senusret describes the Nubians in language calibrated to strip them of political legitimacy and, beneath that, of dignity. He characterizes them as cowards who retreat at the first sign of force, who collapse when pressed, who are not worthy opponents but irritants to be managed through overwhelming violence. He records destroying their crops, seizing their cattle, carrying off their women, burning their grain stores. The inventory of devastation is specific, not "I conquered them," but a catalogue of exactly what was taken and ruined, item by item, in the same administrative detail that characterized everything this reign produced. And then the stela addresses the future directly. Senusret speaks not to his subjects, not to the Nubians, but to the pharaohs who will come after him. Any king who maintains this boundary is his son, his true heir. Any king who fails to defend it, who lets the border slip, who accommodates rather than fights, is not his son. The disowning is explicit. Cut into stone at the edge of the world, visible to every garrison officer who passed it for generations, a dead pharaoh's conditional love hanging over every future ruler like a clause in a contract that could never be renegotiated. Here is what I hear in that stela, underneath the vehemence: fear. Not of the Nubians. The military reality was heavily in Egypt's favor, and Senusret knew it. Fear of impermanence. Fear that the system he had built, the fortresses, the departments, the centralized state, the ritual destruction of enemies conducted with clinical regularity, would not survive him. The very aggression of the language is a tell. A ruler confident in legacy does not need to threaten future kings from beyond the grave. A ruler performing confidence, projecting it into stone because he suspects the stone is all that will hold. That ruler writes the Semna stela and the Nubians themselves. The Egyptian record, and I want to be straightforward about this, does not preserve their perspective. Almost nothing does. What survives from this period and this region is almost entirely Egyptian in origin. The fortress records, the stelae, the dispatches, the execration deposits. We are hearing one side of a frontier, the side with the scribes and the institutional memory and the mud brick walls designed to outlast everything around them. The communities south of the cataracts, the ones Senusret raided, the ones whose chiefs were named on figurines and smashed into sand, the ones whose daily movements were tracked by watchtower officers and filed in triplicate. They left no equivalent archive. This does not mean they were voiceless. It means their voices did not survive inside the medium that history selects for. Archaeology at Nubian sites, the Kerma culture particularly, which was the major Nubian polity during this period, yields material culture of sophistication and depth, funerary evidence, craft traditions, urban planning at the Kerma capital that suggests a complex, well-organized society operating on its own terms with its own political structures, its own trade networks, its own relationship to the river and the land. They were not the disorganized, craven population the Semna Stela describes. They were a civilization, adjacent to Egypt, pressured by Egypt, defined by Egypt's archive as subordinate, but not subordinate in fact. The execration texts carry their names. The figurines hold the identities of their rulers, spelled out in hieratic, mothers' names included. The intelligence sharp enough to identify specific individuals in specific positions of authority. The Egyptian state knew who they were, knew their names, knew their mothers' names, knew enough to catalogue them, target them and ritually destroy them on a regular schedule, and then erased them from meaningful history by ensuring that the only context in which those names survived was the context of their intended annihilation. Think about what that means. The earliest written evidence for some of these Nubian leaders, in several cases the only written evidence, is a curse. Their existence enters the historical record through a document designed to end their existence. They are preserved only in the instrument of their destruction. The archive remembers them because the archive tried to forget them. And the forgetting, by the logic of the ritual, was supposed to be permanent. It wasn't. The desert preserved what the priests meant to annihilate. The fragments were dug up. The names were read. And now, 4,000 years later, a scribe's careful handwriting on a shard of broken clay is the thread that connects a Nubian chief's name to anything at all. Not because someone honored him, not because his own people carved his deeds into a cliff face the way the nomarchs at Beni Hassan did, but because an Egyptian bureaucrat working from an intelligence list in a fortress at the edge of the known world wrote his name neatly on a piece of clay before handing it to a priest to be shattered. The Mirgissa fortress, the pit inside its walls, the figurines, the dispatches, the red pots and the ash and the bound figure at the bottom. And beyond the fortress, south, past the cataract, into territory the watchtowers could see but not quite reach, the people whose names fed the lists, living in the same period, breathing the same air, visible from the walls. And every year, or however often the ritual was performed, new figurines were made, new names were written. The old enemies were joined by new ones, or replaced by ones the state had only recently identified, and the whole process repeated. Inscription, formula, smashing, burial. The pit filled slowly over time, layer after layer, name after name. A pharaoh's fears committed to clay and ground into the earth in careful annual deposits, while the Nile churned over granite outside the walls, and the officers filed their nightly reports about 2 men and 3 women seen heading north. The system held. For a while. But systems always hold for a while. There is a particular kind of silence in the Egyptian archive that is not absence but erasure. The difference between a document that was never written and a document that was written, filed, and then made to disappear. Scholars who work with Middle Kingdom administrative papyri learn to recognize the texture of this silence, a sequence of names in a labor roster that skips a rank, a property transfer that references a previous owner but does not name them, a judicial record that begins mid-sentence, as though the first half of the text, the half that identified the accused, had been physically removed. Senusret III's reign is full of these silences. Not dramatic gaps, not the kind of obvious mutilation you find when a later pharaoh attacks a predecessor's cartouches with a chisel. Smaller silences, administrative ones, the kind that only become visible when you know what should be there and notice that it isn't. I bring this up because the execration texts, for all their violence and specificity, were only one instrument in an arsenal that operated largely through paperwork. The ritual smashing is vivid. It makes for good television. It produces striking museum displays. It gives this episode its title. But the deeper machinery of Senusret's vengeance was not conducted in pits at the border. It was conducted in offices, in filing systems, in the quiet, patient reclassification of people from one administrative category to another until the original category ceased to exist. The nomarchs are the clearest case, but they were not the only one. Scattered across the Middle Kingdom record and concentrated in the period of Senusret III and his successor Amenemhat III are traces of a broader restructuring of elite identity. Court titles multiplied. That might sound like the opposite of a purge, but it functioned as one. When everyone holds a title, no title confers independent authority. The proliferation of honors was a dilution of power disguised as its distribution. A nomarch whose family had governed the hair nome for 5 generations might now hold 3 court titles, each one prestigious, each one meaningless, ceremonial designations that placed him in the pharaoh's orbit without giving him anything to govern. And the new administrative class that replaced the old provincial elite left a different kind of trace in the record. Their tombs, when they built tombs at all, are smaller. Located at the capital or near royal pyramid complexes, not in their ancestral provinces. Their autobiographical inscriptions emphasize loyalty and service to the king, not independent achievement. The self-portrait of the Egyptian elite shifted within a single generation from "I governed my territory with strength and wisdom" to "I served the king faithfully and he rewarded me." The grammar of power changed, and grammar in a civilization that believed language shaped reality was never just grammar. This is the context in which the execration texts operated. Not as an isolated ritual practice, but as one component of a comprehensive system designed to identify, monitor, and neutralize every source of power that did not originate from the throne. The fortresses watched the border, the dispatches tracked movement. The administrative restructuring dissolved regional authority. The court title system absorbed the old elite into a decorative hierarchy, and the figurines, the lists of names, the formula, the smashing, addressed whatever remained. The threats that couldn't be watched, restructured, or absorbed. The ones that existed only as possibility. The ones that lived, as the formula specified, in the space of "may think of rebelling." What strikes me, after years inside this system, is not the harshness. Other pharaohs were harsher. Senusret III did not build fields of impaled enemies or record massacres in gleeful detail the way some New Kingdom pharaohs did. His Semna Stela is aggressive, yes, but it is the aggression of a bureaucrat, not a sadist. Comprehensive rather than theatrical, systematic rather than spectacular. The violence was not the point. The completeness was the point. Every variable accounted for, every name written down, every possibility, from overt rebellion to the mere thought of it, enclosed within the system's reach. The genius, if you want to call it that, and I'm not sure I do, was architectural. Senusret III did not build a system of punishment. He built a system of enclosure. And the execration ritual was its final wall, the one that closed the circle around threats the physical walls could not contain. But systems of enclosure have a cost, and the cost is not always paid by the people inside them. There is a scholarly observation, not widely discussed, and I should note that it rests on inference rather than direct evidence, that the execration practice may have intensified under Senusret III, not because the threats increased, but because the system required threats in order to justify itself. An intelligence apparatus that identifies enemies must produce enemies. A ritual system maintained by professional priests on a regular schedule must have names to inscribe. A pharaoh whose entire governing philosophy rests on the elimination of uncontrolled variables must, by the logic of his own position, never run out of variables to control. I don't know if this is what happened. The evidence is too fragmented to say with certainty that the lists grew longer than the actual threat environment warranted. But the institutional incentive is clear, and it is not unique to ancient Egypt. Any system built on the identification of enemies develops a structural need for enemies to identify. The apparatus sustains itself by finding what it was designed to find, and the absence of threats becomes, paradoxically, the most threatening thing of all, because it implies the apparatus is unnecessary. Senusret III's face, that tired, burdened, deliberately aged face, may have been advertising exactly this. Not just the weight of ruling, but the weight of vigilance that could never rest, because resting would mean admitting that the system had done its work and could be scaled back, which would mean the system had no further reason to exist, which was unthinkable to the people whose livelihoods and status and theological authority depended on its continuation. The priests who performed the ritual, the scribes who maintained the lists, the intelligence officers who filed the dispatches, the fortress commanders who reported every traveler to the capital, the viziers who oversaw the 3 departments, every one of them had a professional interest in the perpetuation of the system that employed them. And the system could only be perpetuated if there were names to write, figurines to smash, borders to watch, variables to control. I am speculating now. I want to be clear about that. The sources do not say the lists grew longer than the threats justified. The sources say almost nothing about the relationship between the lists and actual military or political conditions. That gap in the archive, the one I mentioned at the beginning, remains. But the institutional logic is legible even where the documents are not. And after 2 decades with Egyptian administrative material, I trust institutional logic more than I trust the silences that surround it. What I trust most of all, though, is the ending. Not the ending of Senusret III, He died presumably in the 39th year of his reign, around 1839 BCE, and was buried in a pyramid complex at Dashur with the full apparatus of royal burial. His name's intact, his monument standing, his system firmly in place. His son Amenemhat III inherited the throne and the machinery, and for another 45 years or so, the system hummed. The fortresses were maintained, the dispatches continued, the administration deepened its reach. By some measures, Amenemhat III's reign was the peak of Middle Kingdom civilization, the wealthiest, most productive, most administratively sophisticated period in Egyptian history to that point. And then it ended. Not with a bang, not with an invasion or a revolution or a single catastrophic event. The Middle Kingdom dissolved, slowly, unevenly, through a process that scholars still debate and that the sources illuminate only in fragments. The 13th dynasty saw a rapid succession of short-reigning kings. Central authority weakened. The elaborate administrative structure that Senusret III had built began to fracture. Regional powers reasserted themselves, not the old nomarchs who were long gone, but new local strongmen filling the vacuum that central weakness created. And in the north, a foreign population that the Egyptians called the Hyksos, Levantine settlers who had been present in the delta for generations, gradually consolidated control over Lower Egypt, establishing their own dynasty and pushing the Egyptian state into a diminished southern rump. The Second Intermediate Period. Egypt fragmented again. The system that had watched every traveler at the Second Cataract, that had ground the names of foreign rulers into sand, that had dissolved an entire provincial elite through the sheer weight of administrative precision. That system could not sustain itself. The fortresses in Nubia were abandoned or fell under Kerma's control. The intelligence apparatus went silent. The dispatches stopped. And the names on the execration lists, the Nubian chiefs, the Levantine rulers, the people whose destruction had been so carefully, so professionally, so ritually enacted, their political descendants were still there, still governing, still trading, still living in the territories that the figurines had been designed to empty of resistance. The clay was shattered, the people endured. There is no final execration text that records the moment the system recognized it had failed. No last figurine inscribed with the name that would never be smashed, because the priest had already left and the fortress was empty. The practice simply stops appearing in the record. Whether it ended abruptly or tapered off, whether the last scribe assigned to the lists knew he was the last or simply assumed someone else would continue the work, the archive does not say. It rarely does at the end of things. What remains is the fit at Mirgissa, the shards in the museums in Berlin and Brussels, the fragments that scholars have spent decades reassembling, reading, debating, and contextualizing, and the names, hundreds of them, maybe thousands across all the collections, written in neat hieratic by professionals who believed they were destroying real people through the power of written language and ritual violence, preserved by the same desert that was supposed to bury them forever. Senusret III built a system designed to account for every threat, control every variable, and destroy every enemy, not just on the battlefield, but in the realm of possibility itself. The system was thorough, it was precise, it was, within its own logic, complete, and it lasted about 150 years, which is both a very long time and, measured against the civilization that produced it, barely a breath. the statues remain: the tired face, the furrows, the set jaw. Still performing the cost of vigilance in museums where the lighting is soft and the air is climate controlled and visitors walk past on their way to something more famous. The face says, "I carried this weight." The face says, "The burden was real." And somewhere in a storage drawer in a European museum, wrapped in acid-free tissue, labeled with a catalogue number and a date range, a fragment of clay the size of a child's palm holds half a name in hieratic script. The name of someone who lived, who governed, who was identified by the state as a threat, and who was ritually destroyed in a pit at the edge of the known world by people who believed that writing could kill. The name is broken. The person is gone. The system that targeted them is gone. The pharaoh who built the system is a face in a glass case, performing exhaustion for an audience he could never have imagined. And the desert, which kept the cord, the clay, the ash, the formula, the names, the desert kept everything. It just didn't care who won. Let me know what you want to understand next. The archive is deep,